Good afternoon to you all. My name is Greg Mills from South Africa. I'm a member of the board of the Delphi Forum. It's a great pleasure to be here and to welcome a fellow South African to this panel, or this chat as it's termed, to talk a little bit about what the Trump presidency means for Africa. And with me I have the Honourable Ryan Smith, who's a member of Parliament, a member of the National Assembly of South Africa, and is a member of the Portfolio Committee on Foreign Affairs in the Parliament of South Africa. Ryan is not to be confused with Elon Musk, in spite of the fact that he's wearing a T-shirt. His sartorial standard is entirely down to his transfer through Istanbul this morning. So you can blame it on Turkish Airlines if you want to. I know that would be a very Greek thing to do. But it's no disrespect meant by it. Africa has not enjoyed a very strong last decade. If you take our per capita income in US dollar terms, our real per capita income since 2013, our per capita income has increased by negative 1%. In fact, it has decreased by 1%. Around the world, it has gone up by 20% in terms of overall income. In Asia, and you've just had an Asian panel, it's gone up by 42%. In America, it's gone up by 20%. In Europe, despite a decade of relatively slow growth, it has gone up by 16.7%. Even in Latin America and in the Middle East and North Africa, that figure has steadily risen. Africa is the outlier, unfortunately, and this is in part down to very high rates of population growth. As Africa doubles its population over the next generation, of course, we have to put in place systems that allow for that and which rise the rate of growth, but also improve our educational and governance standards. And that's a challenge before all of us. And in some respects, this challenge has been made more difficult by the Trump administration. And here, as I said, to talk about that is Ryan Smith. But nine months ago even, certainly 10 months ago, we had an entirely different government in South Africa. We had a single-party dominated government which had essentially been running South Africa since the advent of democracy in 1994 in the form of the African National Congress. Come the election of the 29th of May last year, the ANC was brought below 50%. In fact, its share of the vote was brought down to 40%. And a government of national unity was formed along with the principal opposition parties, the largest of which is a party that Ryan belongs to, which is the Democratic Alliance. So the question I would like to start off with by asking Ryan is simply, what difference has this change in political fortunes in South Africa made over the last 9 months?
Thank you, Greg, and thank you to all the viewers. Firstly, my apologies. I had every intention of wearing a suit today, but I landed a few hours ago and my bag got lost somewhere between Cape Town and Athens. But I think I'm channeling my inner Zelensky by not wearing a suit today, so I'm going to take it on the chin. Very good question. South Africa's in a really, really interesting space at the moment, because you talk about the first time our country's in a coalition dispensation within democracy post-94. But even before 94, we also had single-party rule for about 40 years. So it's actually the first time that South Africa is having a coalition dispensation for the first time ever in about 70 years, since the formal republic was formed at the start of the 20th century. And it's caused a massive psychological shift in South Africa for many voters, because one-party domination has almost been entrenched in the minds of South African voters. There was never a belief that we could have a system where another party could win a majority, or even if we could have a coalition government that we see now. And so there's been a massive psychological shift, I think, in the country over the last year, and a real sense of renewal and new possibility that voters are starting to experience. And it's really, I think, what makes it so exciting is you're seeing the growing pains of democracy taking place in Africa. And what makes it so, I think, exciting for me is that Africa's got a bad rap when it comes to democracies and to institutions. We've got, thankfully, in the southern African region, some very, very healthy democracies by the likes of Zambia, Botswana, Namibia to a certain extent, in South Africa. But moving into the space where you're seeing a more kind of developed grey area in democracy is certainly creating new room for discussion and new room for, I think, best practice for coalitions on the African continent.
Well, thank you. And we're also joined here in this hall by the Minister of Finance and his policy advisors of the Republic of Zambia. And we'll be talking about Zambia tomorrow as a brief advertisement about the challenges of recovery and of transition through reform, which Zambia has managed so spectacularly well over the last 3 years. So there is real hope for change. But one of the challenges that South Africa faces, and as a born, bred, and patriotic South African, unfortunately I have to say this, is we've not only been hit by tariffs, well, yesterday we were hit by tariffs. This morning we woke up and we weren't hit by tariffs anymore. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. But we were hit by tariffs. But we were also hit by a very negative slant to our relationship with the United States under Trump. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that South Africa has been treated or kind of seen by the international community with a halo over its head. You know, we had the post-94 democratic dispensation, you had Nelson Mandela, you had the ANC come in, and South Africa was granted a lot of preferential access to markets by means of something like the African Growth and Opportunity Act by the United States. And I think that over successive ANC majorities, the ANC became complacent in terms of its foreign policy and its foreign trade objectives. And we see that foreign policy in South Africa was starting to drift away from the constitutional principles in our founding sort of laws and legislation, and more towards the political whims of the ANC, which is the governing party, or has been the governing party over the last 30 years. And so what we see now, and we as the opposition had warned about this for many years, that South Africa needs to recenter its foreign policy. We must make sure that we take decisions on a principled basis. The minute we start to indulge in the political whims of a particular party, or kind of move away from what we stand for as a nation, it is going to create problems for us. And I think that the ANC, when it ran the foreign policy unilaterally, was so used to being able to do whatever it wanted on the international stage with no recourse and with no sort of sense of punishment, cozying up to administrations that were completely illiberal, giving Zimbabwe a complete blank check to continue without any consequence, you know, seeing democracy completely backslide in Zimbabwe and other parts of Africa. And there was no real consequence for South Africa for abandoning those constitutional principles. And, you know, foreign policy doesn't take place in a vacuum. There's always a reaction normally. And South Africa's gotten away quite easily, I think, over the last 2 decades. The Trump administration is very different. They are not treating South Africa with kid gloves. They're not treating us in a preferential way. And depending on who you ask, and you know, you could argue either point, it could be seen as both a good and a bad thing for South Africa. Yes, in the short term, there's going to be some impact in terms of the tariffs that are being imposed. But long term, it's actually a very good way of saying to South Africa, you don't just get to decide foreign policy on a whim. This is not an ad hoc process that you can just decide. There must be something rooted in a set of principles. There must be something that represents the people of South Africa and the constitution that we fought so hard to create. And the minute we deviate from that, there must be consequences for whoever takes those bad decisions. And so I think we're now coming into a space where we see South Africa acting on the international stage in a more realistic and pragmatic way, and with a world that actually shows consequences and is a lot more transactional than it previously was.
I mean, one of the challenges for Africa is we're always seen as a problem to be solved rather than as an opportunity to be entertained. And the big change over the next generation is, as I've already mentioned, is that our population numbers are doubling to 2.5 billion people within the next generation. It's an extraordinary transformation of this giant, young, youthful, dynamic market of 2.5 billion people. Frankly, for Greece and for other countries in this region, just a stone's throw away to access it. Now, South Africa is often perhaps pictured also as a country which has more problems than solutions. But I mentioned Elon Musk at the beginning of this conversation. We're also brimful in the continent with economic talent. Elon Musk is a product of South Africa, for good or bad. That's where he comes from, and some of his idiosyncrasies seem to stem from. But there are many other successful South African entrepreneurs, Southern African entrepreneurs. The continent is blessed with an enormous stock of critical minerals. We have Zambia here in the audience. There's massive possibilities, particularly in this youthful dynamism and youthful energy. More than half of young people under the age of 35 are going to be African by the turn of this century. I mean, it's a fantastic opportunity for those who are early movers. What do you think, Ryan, is needed to realize the ambition of an integrated Africa, of a single market Africa? How would you list the set of priorities?
Gosh, that's a good question. Look, I think the bedrock of creating successful African societies and economies is stability, security, and I would say institutions, institutionalizing democracy and institutionalizing institutions, rather, into African countries. I think that South Africa gets weakened the more we see a backslide away from democracy into a sort of benign dictatorship or complete authoritarian governments. And I think that without that as the bedrock of any African society, we won't see any progress on the African continent. And I think therein lies all of the problems. And I mean, Greg, you wrote a very good book actually called Expensive Poverty, where Africa also is seen as this recipient in perpetuity of foreign aid. But foreign aid actually does very little if there aren't strong institutions and strong democratic societies that are free of corruption by means of those institutions to make sure that that money comes in and is spent where it's supposed to be spent. Because otherwise you're sending foreign aid in bunches and bunches and bunches to Africa, but it doesn't go to where it should be targeted. And so without democracy, without those institutions, without the rule of law, for example, you won't be able to kickstart and really ignite Africa's potential. So I think that kind of is the bedrock of what you need first and foremost. On top of that, I think Africa needs to leverage its unique sort of standpoints on the international stage. Yes, South Africa is mostly commodities driven. It's rich in minerals and natural resources, but I think that if you look at Africa's labor market, it should be leveraged in the same way. Africans are incredibly resourceful people. They make something out of nothing. And I think entrepreneurship and SMMEs are certainly, I think, the best way to get business and economies off the ground in Africa. But added to that, we need to embrace economic policies in African countries that really match the labor framework. So we don't have very educated populations in Africa. They might be very young, but they don't have the same level of education as what you would see in the developed world, for example. But if you're going to pursue an investment strategy that matches investment with that particular labor force, you can actually find a good way, I think, of finding a sustainable way of bringing investment into Africa while employing people at the same time, growing national fiscus bodies, and really creating a more sustainable African economy. And then on top of that, you can look at something like the African Free Continental Trade Agreement. I always get the actual acronym wrong. Where the dream of Africa functioning in the same way that the European Union does then comes into play, where you can have trade beyond borders without tariffs, without inhibitors, where you can have, I mean, Africans already talking about a single currency, for example, or talking about a single passport. So we even are looking beyond what the European Union has embraced here in Greece, you know. So there's a lot of dreams, I think, for what Africa wants to do, and some very, very good ideas. But as I said, Greg, I think those fundamental basics at the bottom, democracy, sound institutions, building on top of that with sound economic policy, and then really looking at Africa's potential and matching that with international players is the best way for us going forward.
We'll take some questions, but I wondered if there's anybody in the audience that follows rugby. Anybody follow the game of rugby? Nobody? We'll teach you outside afterwards. It's quite an elementary introduction to the sport. But I often say that if you want to see how a successful country works, study our rugby team. 30 years ago, even 15 years ago, in South Africa, we used to have racial quotas. We used to have a system which said that so many of our rugby players had to be black, so many had to be colored, mixed race, so many had to be this or that or white, because it was a white-dominated sport. And along came a new coach, call him the president in this instance, but the coach, and he had a completely different attitude. He said, we will employ the best people to make this a winning rugby team. We will change the team per the opponents that we face, but our goal is to win, because if we win, we will create following and more people will get drawn into the sport. Now, we've won the World Championship, I think it's 4 times, twice in a row, regarded as the best rugby team out there. And if you look at the South African rugby team, it is the full spectrum of the rainbow. Nobody talks about quotas anymore. The majority of the team is not white anymore. It's a completely integrated, well-managed, well-led unit, which is naturally integrated, a bit like Africa could be naturally integrated based on need. In other words, based on demand, based on excellence. And those are some of the principles we have to turn around and put into a business and into an integrative context. So I'm a firm believer, as you've probably heard, in the power of competition. And one of the big changes, Ryan, has been that since the end of the Cold War, of course, in 1980, there were just 2 African democracies. Today, there's more than 30 African countries that regularly hold elections of various quality, but around a dozen that are considered by Freedom House to be a democracy. Zambia, I think, in the last 30 years, 35 years, has had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 changes of government at the polls, I think it is, all of which are peaceful, all of which have proceeded without any upset whatsoever. So democracy has become much more an accepted part of our system of choice and our system of competition. What do you think more can be done to encourage democratic circumstances in the African continent and the competition that goes with it?
I'm going to, I think fostering democracy in Africa is a tough one because you're going up against traditional sort of tribal belief systems that often clash with what democracy stands for. You're going up against very religious societies that often also feel as if religion should have a greater say in the running of a government. And so I think African sort of societies often tend to perceive democracy as a threat. They see it as, not being able necessarily to get the way of African culture or the way that a particular African country runs. There's a lot of debates often between what should be an African country, what should not be an African country in terms of borders. But I think certainly, just to tap into what we were speaking to earlier about the young population of Africa, I think that young Africans live in a very different world than their parents did. And we see this happening in South Africa. If you look at the recent shift in political allegiance in South Africa in particular, it's because the generation that lived under apartheid is slowly dying out. And so the muscle memory or the kind of, the muscle memory of voting with your heart and not with your head is slowly dissipating. And I think even just outside of South Africa, you're seeing in African countries with the digital age and information age and access to social media, you've got young African citizens starting to be exposed to democracies outside of just their own country or in other parts of the world. We can watch protests happening on the other side of the world on TikTok or Instagram. And I think that young people are becoming far more incentivized and sensitized to freedom and to the values that underpin free societies. So I think that's been a very useful tool, I think, in recent times to help incentivize democracy and really bring it to the fore in African societies.
I'm a little bit dismayed that the people who experienced apartheid are dying out, because in fact I was alive under apartheid. But other than that, some questions. Anna, you had your hand up. Is there a microphone or? There we go, here's a microphone coming. Slowly, as it turns out. He needs to be trained by the Springbok rugby team.
So as far as I follow the South African policies, it is interesting that you have the same problem, one of the same problems that the Western societies have, and this is migration. So I would like to tell us a few things about how migration is perceived in South Africa from other African countries. Thank you.
Great question. Do we have any more questions? One over here.
Yes, hello. My name is Marilena Agüero. I'm from Club of Madrid. Greg, and we met before. How are you? This year, South Africa is leading the G20. It was chairing the G20. And I'd love to have your views on how, on the one hand, that is going, and what this means for Africa, obviously, and secondly, the fact that the 2026 G20 is, in theory at least, going to be led by the US. So how you're envisioning that transition or that change. Thank you.
Thank you. Great questions. Last question. There's one over here. A young person. I can speak. Okay. My name is Nicholas Hernandez. I'm from Brenthurst College. Thank you both so much for being here today. I just had a quick question.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. My name is Nicholas Hernandez. I'm from Pitzer College. Thank you both so much for being here today. We've been seeing a lot of America First policies from Trump, whether it be potential tariffs or cutting of U.S. aid. How do you think South Africa, and especially the youth in South Africa, is responding? Do they want to be more collaborative with the USA and are separating Trump from USA, or are they leaning more into that competition and protectionist policies?
Thank you. There's some great questions there. I'll give Ryan a stab, and maybe I'll try and wrap up with a couple of answers of my own.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to be as brief as I can because I'm keeping an eye on the time. Migration in South Africa is not dissimilar, I think, to how you perceive it in Western countries. We have a lot of migration between African states. South Africa in particular receives a lot of, I wouldn't even call them migrants, I'd call them refugees coming from Zimbabwe, fleeing the regime under the ZANU-PF that's been in power for the last, I would say, 40 years. The problem is that because of the high levels of inequality and unemployment in South Africa, foreigners are used as the scapegoat by many populist and radical politicians, and that narrative is sown into South African society as well. So I don't think that by nature South Africans are xenophobic or anti-migration. We want it to happen legally, and I think we're very receptive to having migrants come into the country. But in the context of rampant unemployment, particularly youth unemployment and inequality, it creates a lot of tension, I think, between South Africans and other African citizens coming into the country. So I hope that gives you a little bit of context. Migration is a big problem. I think because it places an unnecessary burden on South Africa. We've got these citizens coming in who don't pay tax but are reliant on the services that South African citizens pay for. So it's not dissimilar to what I think Europeans are experiencing with migrants coming from other parts of the world. So I think in the way that you see it in Europe is very similar to how it happens in South Africa, just with different countries and different migrants, to answer that question. The G20, very, very good question. It's a pity because our G20 presidency has been so overshadowed by everything else happening in the world. I don't think anyone has heard, even us at home, I mentioned it in my committee the other day, we don't hear about any of the engagement groups, we don't hear about any of the resolutions that might have been taken, any of the agreements that might have been signed. We, as a party, sent a list of proposed objectives and outcomes that we wanted from the G20 to the president. We haven't heard back from him, but I think that we've been so tied up with dealing with the Trump administration coming in, Trump and Marco Rubio refusing to attend the G20. Marco Rubio said that he wouldn't come to the foreign ministers' meeting, which was a big blow to us. We were lucky enough to have the charge d'affaires who came to the foreign ministers' meeting. But to add insult to injury, the US is inheriting the G20 presidency from us. So whatever our agenda is going to be, we have to make sure that we achieve it by, I think it's the end of November this year when the US takes over, because there's no guarantee that whatever our agenda for the G20 will be carried over. In fact, I think it's safe to say that it will not be carried over. And so it's almost as if South Africa is running out of time. We've been given this tiny, tiny window to leverage as much as we can from the G20. And that's what we've certainly been pushing for. We said use it wisely. It's an immense window of international opportunity for South Africa, especially in the GNU context.
30 seconds, Trump.
To really leverage what we need to leverage. So I'll leave it at that. Trump, I think South Africans are practical people. I think they understand that the Trump administration's reaction to South Africa's foreign policy decisions in some ways is just. But I think that the tariffs, especially if you look at it in the global context where it just seems very erratic and maybe ill-thought, South Africans are struggling to understand that. We've got a 30% tariff, I think, on South African exports. The last time I checked, it changes every day. And that will deal a deathly blow to South Africa, because if you look at what we export to the United States compared to China, for example, China is the recipient of commodities. They take raw minerals and ingredients from South Africa, whereas what we export to the US is manufactured goods and agricultural exports, agri-processed goods. And that's what South Africa needs. We want to develop our manufacturing sector. We want markets for those. The minute those markets are cut off or made more difficult for us to enter, it has an immediate effect on jobs in particular. The South African Citrus Growing Association has estimated that 35,000 jobs are on the line because of the tariffs. So it's bad. But just to wrap up, there's an opportunity for us to strike a really good deal for South Africa, and I think this is where diplomacy really comes into play, and South Africa's got a very important role to play as well.
Thanks very much, Ryan. An excellent job in spite of wearing a T-shirt. Two quick things for you to remember. I think it's fantastic that Africa is featuring on the Delphi Forum's platform. Thank you very much, Simeon, for having us here. Just remember this one statistic. When this is a 10 billion person world, 25% of that number will be from Africa. There needs to be a commensurate voice, particularly among young people. And the second thing related to the last point is aid has been a terrible way of developing. It's not been a bad way of dealing with humanitarian disasters, but a terrible way of developing. We can use, particularly from an African perspective, this opportunity to develop a vision of Africa beyond aid. Instead of being a problem to be solved, it's a partnership and an opportunity to be entered into. May that narrative change quickly from aid to business, and may this be a contribution towards that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.